hear me and see me, Rudolph Clay, Brad Short, and of course, our speaker, Professor Schvey. The webinar is being recorded and we will share it later on the University Library's website. We invite you to submit questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Professor Schvey will answer questions at the end of his presentation. Now, I would like to introduce my friend and colleague, Brad Short, who serves as the University Library's Music, Film and Media Studies, and Performing Arts Librarian. And Brad will introduce Professor Schvey. Brad?
Excuse me. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce today's lecture by Professor Henry Schvey, Professor of Drama and Comparative Literature here at Washington University. Professor Schvey joined the faculty in 1987 and served as chair of the Performing Arts Department for 20 years. His writings include academic books on Tennessee Williams and Oscar Kokoschka, numerous essays and articles, plays, and poetry. He's an active stage director, having close to 50 productions to his credit, and perhaps most telling to some of us, even though a native New Yorker, Professor Schvey became a Cardinals fan from afar in 1968, presumably after watching Bob Gibson's record-setting year. Related to our discussions today, his resume reveals his super sleuthing skills in a New Orleans bookstore in 2004, when he found an old 1937 Washington University Blue examination booklet of Tennessee Williams containing Williams' forgotten poem, Blues Song. In his latest book, Blues Song, St. Louis and the Life and Work of Tennessee Williams, Professor Schvey describes how our city was essential to Williams' formation, both as a person and as an artist. From 1918 until 1938, Williams lived in St. Louis, the longest he lived anyplace throughout his life. Professor Schvey argues that Williams could never have become the writer he was without St. Louis's influence. Furthermore, he divulges Williams' often willfully suppressed connections to WashU, Mizzou, and the Webster Groves Theater Guild. Join me in welcoming Professor Schvey.
Thank you so much, Brad. That was a very personal introduction, and I really appreciated it. And we can talk Cardinals baseball instead of Tennessee Williams if you'd prefer. But maybe we should wait for another occasion, because it was Bob Gibson that turned me on to the Cardinals, and the fact that my wife is from St. Louis. So I want to thank in particular the four people who've helped make this talk possible: Rudolph Clay, Shannon Sowell, Lauren Streibel, and Brad Short. And Brad, I've known you the longest, and I really appreciate your support and interest in the performing arts, and specifically in this project. I've been asked to do a number of talks on the book in recent weeks and months, but this one feels different, and it's a particular honor because it's at the library, even though it's virtual. And so I thought going in a different direction might be useful. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that my book, Blue Song, is also a study of the library and the involvement of the library and special collections and bookstores and books and book censorship are really all of a piece in this book, in Blue Song. So I wanted to briefly, although Brad mentioned it, briefly go over some of the background. I was asked just a few days ago for how long had I been working on this book? How long had I been writing it? And I answered something glib, say a couple of days, joking, of course. And that got me started to think, how long have I really been working on this book? And really that in some ways is a start of this lecture. And I want to talk about it because I think it's of interest. So this book, in some ways, every book is a discovery of sorts. In a sense, the discovery of this book was deciding really who Tennessee Williams belonged to. The scholarly view is very clear on this. Tennessee Williams, I'm paraphrasing here somewhat generally, Tennessee Williams discovered his homosexuality in New Orleans in 1938 and shed the skin of provincial St. Louis forever. That is very much the Tennessee Williams that the author himself wanted us to believe happened. In fact, that's not really true. And so my writing this book was in part an investigation into the role of St. Louis in this author's life and his work. But I'm going to backtrack and answer my own question about a discovery and how I got involved with this project in the first place. As Brad mentioned, I arrived in St. Louis in 1987, in the end of August. And when I got there, one of the lecturers in our department in public speaking, sadly she's deceased now, Valerie Safran, informed me that Tennessee Williams had been a student at Washington University, but had left before graduation. I didn't know that. I hadn't realized that. And perhaps some people in the audience right now in this lecture aren't aware of it. And then Val went on to tell me, did I know that there was an unpublished play in the university archives? And she had read it and she said, you won't find it very good. It's just a kind of juvenile experiment, but it's there. And maybe you'd like to take a look at it. And I sort of filed it away. I didn't think much of it at the time. So this was in 1987, of course. I went to the library, read the play, and I agreed for the most part that it was kind of melodramatic, and it wasn't very good, and the world could probably do without it. That's what I thought. Again, 1987. Fast forward to 2004. It was the sesquicentennial of Washington University that year in 2004 and 5. And a call went out from the dean's office to offer the possibility of celebrating former graduates of the university, people who had been celebrated and who had some history at Washington University. And I took that as something of a challenge. And I proposed Tennessee Williams, raising myself the caveat that, of course, Williams hadn't graduated from the school, but still had been a student here for 1 year. And in addition, had been an SNCD student, not candidate for degree, for the previous year. And he had been here from 1936 to 1937. And that I thought it might be worthwhile to do something to celebrate his life or his connection with Washington University. So that was 2004. And I suppose you could say that my interest began there, if not earlier. But so at any rate, we celebrated the sesquicentennial, and I contacted the playwright's brother, Dakin Williams, who lived at that time in Collinsville, was also a graduate of Washington University and was a lawyer. And Dakin was very enthusiastic about the plans for the sesquicentennial conference. And he suggested that we call it the secret year. And I said to him, why? He said, because Tennessee didn't mention that year in his memoirs, in his autobiography. And I think he was ashamed of it. And I thought that would be an interesting, titillating kind of title. And we set about inviting a number of international scholars, scholars of considerable renown from the UK and from Belgium, who were Tennessee Williams specialists. And then, in addition, we decided I would direct production of the Glass Menagerie, which I had directed in the Netherlands, where I had been teaching before coming to WashU in '87. And it's a wonderful, wonderful play. And I'm sure many of you, perhaps everyone listening to this, is familiar with Glass Menagerie. And we'll come back to that in a second. But it also looked like it would be a marvelous occasion for this unveiling, for this obscure play that no one knew about. And I knew it would be of interest, certainly to the scholars in attendance for the sesquicentennial celebration. So we decided to produce Mi Vache. I signed it to a postdoctoral student because I was busy directing Glass Menagerie, but I, as chair of the department, I wanted to oversee it as well. I asked Dakin whether we needed to get any permissions to produce Mi Vache. He said, no, I've given you permission. And so I went along with that, and we continued until the night before the conference opened, at which time I was told by the estate that we didn't have permission and that they would cancel the production if we didn't pay the rights. So that's a sort of sidebar to this discussion, but an interesting one. So we did Mi Vache. I want to tell you a little bit about the rehearsal process of that play. It is now published. It was published in 2011 by a Tennessee Williams colleague who had connections with New Directions Press. And the production itself was fascinating, and it forced me to reevaluate that play, that early play, Mi Vache. It's basically about an armaments manufacturer who is the lord of several countries because he's withholding armaments from both sides in a fictitious world war. This was written in 1937. At the time, the students who were present, including the illustrious writer A.E. Hotchner, felt that the play really wasn't very interesting. And another colleague of Hotchner's, Martile Schvey, exclaimed that it gave her a chance to do her homework for her next class, and that Tennessee Williams used to sit there in his shiny purple suit, the same suit he wore every day, and she called the play boring, which I can imagine it would have seemed, especially the way Tennessee may have read it. I'm not going to tell you it's a great play now, but I am going to tell you it's a very important play and a very interesting play in spite of that. So the main character is a kind of Donald Trump clone who sits at a desk twirling the globe and smoking a big cigar, and with a bust of Alexander the Great and Caesar on his desk. And reading the play or hearing the play, as the students must have been rather tedious, and it didn't speak to the lives of their students. Hotchner later told me he fully expected that Williams' entry would have been something out of the Glass Menagerie, because he kept handing in these little vignettes to the class to do readings. But we need to also remember, at the time in 1937, Tennessee Williams was not the age of a typical undergraduate. In fact, he was in his late 20s. Williams was born in 1911, so he would have been 26, about to turn 27, when he was working on this play. And that's important. Why? Because Williams had already had 3 full-length plays produced here in St. Louis, and he had won a prize at the Webster Groves Theater Guild, as Brad alluded to in his opening remarks. Williams used to sit alongside Professor Carson, facing the rest of the students. I guess a little bit arrogant, and but as befits perhaps somebody who's already a produced playwright in a class that included freshmen like Aaron Hotchner. At any rate, when I oversaw the rehearsals for Mi Vache, I realized that there was another play inside the play, and that the play was justifiably ridiculed by the students because they took it as straightforward realism. In fact, what it was a kind of fantasy. And so at the last minute, we put a 10-foot high desk in front of the auditorium and had Vasha sitting up way up high like the Wizard of Oz, controlling visits from his servant, Philip, the doctor, and so on. And in the play, the plot is very simple. I can just describe it in one sentence. Vasha is controlling both sides in this war, and the political entities want him out of the way. And so they plot to have Vasha killed. And the doctor smuggles in a gun, smuggles it into Vasha's wife. And at the end of the play, this melodramatic denouement happens where Lady Shantine, his princess wife, comes out and shoots Vasha dead after he pleads for his life. Pretty melodramatic, pretty silly stuff, you might think. But when we set the play as fantasy, with people literally looking up 10 feet in the air to see this man who was venerating himself, it became a somewhat different play. It's also a different play for us now because the key character of the play is not Vasha, the melodramatic villain of the piece. It's his wife, who is insane and kept locked in their bedroom. And at a certain point, Vasha releases her to talk to the doctor. The doctor comes in and treats her, and of course, finds an excuse to smuggle her in this gun, and she shoots him at the end. But what we have in Me, Vasha in 1937 is Tennessee Williams' first portrait of a profoundly disturbed female who is in many respects a direct precursor to Blanche Dubois in A Streetcar Named Desire, which was written, of course, in 1947 and has its home in New Orleans. So I just want to give you a taste for how Lady Shantine speaks in this obscure play, Me, Vasha. The doctor comes out and talks about her hallucinations, and the lady says, "No, doctor, not hallucinations, but real men I see around me, only all of them are dead." And the doctor interrupts, and I'll go on. They come into the room and stand around the bed, and they ask for him, meaning Vasha, the person who is, figuratively speaking, killed them by sending them to the front. They want him to go with them back to where they came from. They say it's time for him to go with them. He sent them there. He's their leader, they say, and they want him to go back there with them. Back where, Lady Shantine? Lady Shantine replies, to the front, the places they were killed, but he won't go. He's afraid to go, doctor, and I know that he ought to go. He belongs with them, and someday they'll insist on his going. They won't take no for an answer, and then he'll have to go with them. And she describes them marching around their bed, begging, pleading for this monster, Vasha, to go back to the front. And so she feels in her delusions that she's carrying out the will of these young boys, these young men. It's pretty strong stuff, in fact. It's not a piece of silly melodrama, or at least not as silly as I certainly thought at first reading. So in some ways, I discovered Tennessee Williams in 1987 when I came to Washington University, and then made a more profound discovery in 2004 when I directed the Glass Menagerie and oversaw the production of Me, Vasha in the Hotchner Studio Theater. But after that sesquicentennial, something else happened, which really made my investment a much deeper one. And that's, I think, relevant to the title of the book. I spoke at a conference in New Orleans on this undiscovered play, still unpublished play called Me, Vasha. And at in New Orleans, where the Scholars Conference was held, there's a Tennessee Williams Festival held every year in New Orleans. This is long before anything was done in St. Louis. I spoke about this play, and I hoped that it might provide some interest to the scholars that were assembled there. At that time, I was wandering around New Orleans. It was my first visit to this wonderful, wonderful city. And of course, anyone who goes to New Orleans can imagine, as touristy as it's become now, what Tennessee Williams must have found there when he first got there in 1938. As a young man, dressed in a suit and tie, coming from provincial St. Louis and arriving at the quarter. Williams said after 3 hours there, he knew he was home, and he did feel home there. Anyway, I was rummaging around in bookstores there just to soak up the atmosphere, and I came upon the Faulkner bookshop in the Pirates Alley in New Orleans. And I asked if they had any sort of memorabilia, information, photographs, anything on Tennessee Williams, because I had been here to present, and I was becoming sort of a, I don't know, a collector. I certainly was interested in Williams in all sorts of ways that I hadn't been before. This was 2005. I was handed by one of the shop owners a sheaf of papers, a plastic folder with some photos of Williams and some letters, and then this thing happened. One of the documents spoke to me directly, and of course, as Brad alluded at the introduction, it was a blue book, and I knew it was the blue book because it was, it had a picture of Brookings Hall. It said Brookings Hall, and it said his name on the cover, T.H. Thomas Lanier Williams, long before he had been Tennessee. Of course, he was Tom Williams here in St. Louis. So I opened the blue book, and I saw that it was a Greek exam. Now, Williams left Washington University rather abruptly in the spring of 1937 because he failed Greek, and also because of the response to Mi Vasha. And I started looking through the Greek exam, and I came upon page after page of mediocre grades, C- and D, and so forth in the exam. And I knew that this was the Greek exam, his final from 1937. For some reason, I turned the next page after the end of the exam, I guess to see if there was another sheet of paper, or if there might have been some comments by the professor. And I turned the page, and I found something that literally gave me chills then, and it still does now as I'm thinking back. And it was a poem. And the poem on the last page, so the page after the end of the exam, was called Sad Song. But the word sad had been erased. The whole exam was in pencil, and it was replaced with the word blue. And I realized that I was in possession of something that presumably no one had seen before. And I was, in all likelihood, the only person besides Tennessee Williams to have ever seen it. I'm going to read you this poem, Blue Song. It was subsequently, 2 years later, published in the New Yorker magazine. Blue Song. I am tired. I am tired of speech and of action. If you should meet me upon the street, do not question me, for I can tell you only my name and the name of the town I was born in, but that is enough. It does not matter whether tomorrow arrives anymore. If there is only this night and after it is morning, it will not matter now. I am tired. I am tired of speech and of action. In the heart of me, you will find a tiny handful of dust. Take it and blow it out upon the wind. Let the wind have it, and it will find its way home. That poem scrawled at the back of a failing Greek exam was even then a powerful statement to me. It spoke to me directly, and of course, I immediately realized it was something of importance. Without waiting, I contacted special collections at the library. I believe I spoke with Chatham Ewing, who was then involved. And Chatham spoke to Dean Shirley Baker and made plans to acquire the booklet from the bookstore, from the Faulkner bookstore. I had nothing to do with the acquisition. This was entirely done by the library. And I told them when I spoke with the library that no one knew about the poem inside. I thought that that would help keep the price reasonable. It was already, several $1,000s, I believe. But goodness knows what it would have been had they known that there was a literary artifact as well as a piece of interesting university ephemera inside. Now, I don't know about the people who are listening to me right now, but I can tell you, as a student who all but flunked out of high school, I was very sensitive to what Williams was feeling at that moment when he wrote the poem. It's not only the fact that a poem was found that was important to me, it was what it was conveying. It conveyed absolute despair. At that time, of course, even though he had written these plays, he didn't know he would be Tennessee Williams. He was a ne'er-do-well, somebody who had left University of Missouri, Columbia in 1932 during the height of the Depression because his father found out that he had flunked ROTC, the Reserve Officer Training Corps, and had spent the next 3 years from 1932 to 1935 working at the International Shoe Company, where his father, C.C. Williams, was a manager. And this was directed at Williams as a kind of punishment. He called Williams Miss Nancy and ridiculed his own son for his apparently effeminate ways. And so the 3 years spent at the International Shoe Company were for Williams a kind of imprisonment. Later on, when he left St. Louis in 1938, he chose to deduct 3 years from his birth date. He was born in 1911, died, by the way, in 1980. But when he left St. Louis, he decided that his birth date would be 1914. He deducted the 3 years, he said, to make up for the 3 years he had been in hard labor at the International Shoe Company as a stocking clerk. And those of you that know the Glass Menagerie realize, of course, that Tom is about to be fired for writing poems on the lid of a shoebox in the Glass Menagerie. And obviously, in this autobiographical play, he's taking that incident from his own life. It also appears in less well-known plays by Williams, such as Stairs to the Roof, that he wrote around the same time that he had drafted earlier. So that was another discovery, finding the poem. Obviously, it's a crucial one. Now, just to digress slightly here, I want you to know that, of course, the library was instrumental in acquiring the manuscript, and Dean Baker arranged for its purchase in 2005. And in some ways, this is a crucial part of this journey that I'm describing to you now. And it's here for all to see in special collections in our library now. Both the Greek exam, Mi Vasha, and of course, the poem Blue Song. But that's why I titled the book Blue Song, because I think what the poem reflects is this immense desire to leave St. Louis, a sense of despair. You notice he refers to the word home frequently in that poem. And at the very end, he says, "In the heart of me, you will find a tiny handful of dust. Take it out and blow it out upon the wind. Let the wind have it, and it will find its way home. Home, I think, can mean whatever you wish. It can mean a spiritual home. He hadn't yet found New Orleans, so it can't be that. But Williams always venerated the South, the deep South, and perhaps that's what he meant. In any case, he wanted to leave here, but he didn't know how. Just to digress again, Williams, as I said, was born in 1911, but they only moved here when he was age 7, and his father accepted the position at the shoe company. And so the earliest years of his life were spent mainly with his mother and grandparents, and he idolized his grandparents. His grandparents paid for the tuition to go back to college at Washington University after the 3-year hiatus he had been forced to take at the shoe company. And so the question of where he lived is a crucial one, and it's crucial in the book too. In some ways, Williams saw himself as a creature of the South. He didn't want to be associated with St. Louis. And to say he hated it here is not an overstatement. He called it Saint Pollution, and he did hate it. But what he hated most really was the family that he lived with, because in St. Louis, as opposed to in Mississippi, Clarksdale, Mississippi, where most of his early childhood was spent, he was born in Columbus, he associated St. Louis with the fights and the torments of his mother, who was smothering and a very difficult person. She was loquacious to a fault, and his father, who, as I already mentioned, was bullying and could be sadistically cruel towards both he and Rose. Dakin was born some 8 years later, and he hit it off pretty well with Dakin. They listened to the Cardinals games on the radio together, and Dakin was the kind of son I think that Cornelius, CC, really wanted. But Rose was very introspective, and of course Tennessee was even more so. So the family haunted them, and it was out of necessity that he escaped St. Louis. It was never really home to him, although it provided a launching pad in many, many respects. And the book spends a lot of time on this. It's very easy to see St. Louis as simply the other, the enemy in this place, in the book. But in fact, Tennessee Williams bequeathed him with many things. And you'll see in the slides as we go over them later, exactly what. For the most part, St. Louis afforded Tennessee Williams education possibilities he would never have had in the Deep South, in Clarksdale. He had excellent teachers here. Ben Blewett Junior High School was on the cutting edge of educational opportunities. He went on from Ben Blewett to University City High, where he wrote and where he saw his first short story published in Weird Tales, a story called The Vengeance of Nitocris, set in ancient Egypt. He also wrote travelogues for the U City Pep newspaper. So St. Louis gave him tremendous wealth in terms of teaching and educational opportunities. It also provided him, specifically at Washington University, with a voice. At WashU, he met 2 particular poets, Clark Mills and William J. Smith. Clark Mills is a name you may not have heard of, although he was a published poet at a very young age. His actual name was Clark Mills McBurney, but he went by Clark Mills. And he exposed Williams to a lot of leftist thinking down by the waterfront. A lot of Williams' early plays, as you'll read if you read my book, are socially committed plays. They're not what we would expect from Tennessee Williams if we just read Streetcar and Glass Menagerie. They're remarkable plays, and I'll talk a little bit about them if we have time in the question period. But so Clark Mills exposed him to left-wing politics. He was an assistant editor with the Anvil, which was a communist paper, and also exposed him to symbolist poetry. both Mills and William J. Smith were very interested in French culture and in France. And so the world of European modernism was open to Williams through his interaction. And the three of them formed what they called a literary factory, in which they would meet sometimes in the basement of Williams' home, one of Williams' homes. Tennessee Williams moved 9 times during the time he was in St. Louis. His mother encouraging the moves each time further west to get away from the heart of St. Louis because she felt snubbed socially by St. Louis. She had been born the daughter of a rector, and now she was just a woman in St. Louis who had aspirations, but no outlet for them. She wanted to join the Wednesday Club and was refused. Edwina Williams, Amanda in Glass Menagerie, of course, Edwina saw St. Louis as snobbish and distant. And she inculcated both her young children with that view as well. So Williams gained, in terms of his proximity to St. Louis, he became a poet here. There's no other way of putting it. He became a poet because he grew up in St. Louis. The other thing he did was launch his career as a theater artist. And his first submissions, the one to the Webster Groves Theater Guild, was made through the offices, actually, of his mother, paradoxically enough. And Williams fell under the spell of a theater company called the Mummers. It was not a professional theater, it was an amateur group, a ragtag group, but Williams later realized that they gave him his start. They were run by a man named Willard Holland, and he encouraged large cast plays about socially relevant subjects. And so Williams' first plays featured casts of 20 to 25 people. Holland himself acted. The first play, Candles to the Sun, is a play about coal mining in Alabama. Yes, Tennessee Williams wrote a play about coal mines in Alabama. It's actually an important play. One of his other plays, which was completely undiscovered for 60 years after its writing, was called Not About Nightingales. It appeared in 1996, years after Williams' death, and was discovered and brought to bear by the Alley Theater in Houston and by the National Theater in Great Britain, and was very successfully performed on Broadway. But that play is about the roasting alive of a dozen prisoners by a dictatorial warden. So again, plays that deal with authority and suppression. Williams was always fascinated by the question of suffocation, suppression. He experienced it firsthand in his life here in St. Louis. And so his plays were written in rebellion. And these early plays, even when they're about socially constructed opposition and conflict, are also about an individual's rebellion against greater forces. Now, I mentioned to you that my history with Tennessee Williams goes back to many different points. One of the points it goes back to, and I just thought about this not when I was writing my book, but when I was contemplating this lecture, was the very first time I read Glass Menagerie. And I looked at it again, and I realized what lifted it off the page for me at the age of 14 or 15 when I first read the play. And I want to quote it for you because I think it's relevant. Maybe, who knows, maybe some of you had the same reaction. It had to do with the idea of escape. I lived in New York growing up, as Brad mentioned, but wanted to leave there and felt that sense of confinement. Williams felt a different kind of confinement. He felt confinement in St. Louis and needed to escape to New York, among other places. But it was this snatch of dialogue that really reminded me of why I fell in love with Tennessee Williams in the first place. The lights come up and Amanda and Tom are fighting, quarreling behind the portieres. Laura is downstage in a clear pool of light. Tom, what in Christ's name am I? Amanda, don't you use that, Tom. Supposed to do. Amanda, expression, not in my presence. Have you gone out of your senses? Tom, I have, that's true. Driven out. Amanda, what is the matter with you, you big idiot? Tom, look, I've got no single thing. Amanda, lower your voice. In my life that I can call my own. Everything is, Amanda, stop that shouting. Tom, yesterday you confiscated my books. You had the nerve to, yes, I took that horrible novel back to the library. Yes, that hideous book by that insane Mr. Lawrence. I cannot control the output of diseased minds or the people who cater to them, but I won't allow such filth brought into this house. No, 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 no. That bit of dialogue, which I had never seen performed, spoke to me intimately about my own life in New York and my relationship with my parents, and it made Tennessee Williams feel like a kindred spirit. I didn't realize anything about the writer. I didn't know he was really born, had been born in the South or grew up in St. Louis or when he had written it, but that spoke to me in a visceral way. Later, when I was teaching in the Netherlands at Leiden University, I had the opportunity to direct the Glass Menagerie for the first time in the mid-1980s, before I came here. So in a way, the gestation for this book is perhaps not 1987 or 2004, but perhaps it's when I was growing up in the mid-1960s and came upon Tennessee Williams' rebellion against his family and against his world for the first time. Now, more recently, the immediate genesis of the book happened in a different way. I was visited by the costume designer of my Dutch production a few years ago, and my wife took her to the Missouri History Museum. And of course, she was interested in St. Louis, having designed the costumes when we did the play in '84. And she asked for a book on Tennessee Williams, and none was to be found. She said, "You mean there isn't a book about the history of Tennessee Williams or his life in St. Louis?" I said, "No, but it doesn't seem so, but I'll check." And so I checked. There were a number of very interesting articles written by other scholars, notably Tom Mitchell and Aline Hale, but there was no full-length study of Williams' relationship to St. Louis. And Cecile, my friend, said, "Well, you must write it." And of course, I poo-pooed the suggestion. I had enough on my plate. But the longer I thought about it, the more I realized, yes, I must write it. And so really, that's in some ways how this project came about, both in the distant past and in the immediate past. And writing it was an astonishing process. As our playwright in residence, Carter Lewis, would say, you write because you have questions. And I had a question to myself about what the real relationship was with St. Louis. Yes, he had lived here for 20 years. Yes, he had hated the place. Yes, it was St. Pollution. But the more I dug under the surface of the veneer dislike, the more I realized that in short story after short story, Williams displaces his situation in St. Louis and puts it into other situations. And so St. Louis was always, and I'm not exaggerating, always with him. He returned here in 1969 when he was interned in a Renard wing of Barnes Hospital for a nervous breakdown. And of course, most notably of all, he's buried here in Calvary Cemetery. Most scholars point to the fact and say how terrible that is, how unbefitting this man who actually chose to be buried at sea, to be buried here in the city's oldest Catholic cemetery under the eternally watchful gaze of his mother. But I think differently. I think there's something extremely apposite about the fact that Williams, although he wanted to escape, he chose to be buried at sea in the place closest to where Hart Crane, his beloved poet, committed suicide. I think there's something extremely fitting as well for this man who really tried his whole life to go forward. En avant was Williams' motto, go forward. to be buried in the one place he could never escape. I think it's poetically fitting and appropriate. That's what I had to really say to you now. And if Lauren is available now to show the slides, I just to quickly go through the slide reproductions that I have to give you a sense of fleshing out the past. And we'll just go through these and then go to our questions. So the early slides show Edwina Williams and Tom as a child in Clarksdale, Mississippi, where he was raised before he came to St. Louis. Next slide, please. Here's a cute picture of him. Child of the South is met with some irony because he was always the child of the South. In fact, again, when the Glass Menagerie came to Broadway and started his career, made him an overnight sensation. In the bio, in the program, he doesn't mention St. Louis. He mentions the schools he had attended, including WashU. But if you read the bio, it suggests as though he'd moved somehow from Clarksdale to Broadway. Next slide. These are two pictures of his father, C.C. Williams, one with Tom as a baby and as branch manager of the International Shoe Company. It's interesting that as Williams got older, he recast his father. Instead of being a tyrant, a villain, he saw his father as a kindred spirit, a man whose violence was predicated on the fact that he could never express himself, and that he saw in the true C.C. Williams a man who was frustrated, sexually frustrated with his wife, who abjured any notion of touch in the home and became an alcoholic and became a violent man. C.C. Williams' ear was bitten off in a bar fight at one point. But Williams forgave his father. He saw him as a kindred spirit, as somebody who was also confined. He was really himself as a traveling salesman, but he was confined to a desk job. And he saw C.C. Williams as, in some ways, stunted by being in St. Louis. Next slide. This is a picture of the family of Edwina Grand, his grandmother, on the extreme right, and Rose at the bottom with her doll, and Ozzie, his nurse. His relationship with Rose is, of course, pivotal throughout Williams' life and in his work. And some of you, I'm sure, are acquainted with that. But of course, it's the focus of the Glass Menagerie, a play which clearly we could also have a full lecture on. His relationship with his sister, just very briefly, though, it's worth noting that, and I would like to point this out, it was during that time in 1936-37, when Williams was enrolled at Washington University, that Rose showed the signs of what was then called dementia praecox, of what we would today call schizophrenia, and had to be hospitalized first at Barnes and then at Farmington, Missouri, where she was institutionalized. And Rose, she was the older sister by nearly 2 years than he, provided a model. And Williams was always certain that he was going to follow her into madness. In 1943, just before he wrote The Glass Menagerie, Rose Williams underwent a prefrontal lobotomy, which rendered her completely passive. It was then a state-of-the-art medical procedure rather than an act of barbarism that we see it as today. But it changed Williams' life and certainly changed the plays that he wrote subsequently. Next slide. I didn't mention Ozzie, but he romanticized Ozzie. Sorry, if we could go back to the previous one. If not, it's okay. Ozzie on the left was their nurse, the family's nurse in Mississippi. And he attributed to Ozzie his delight in storytelling. He talked about her digging to the devil. He said that he was, when his mother interrupted him playing, he said he was digging to the devil in childish imitation, lisping imitation of Ozzie's storytelling exploits. So again, Williams romanticized the South and it forms a kind of polar opposite to what St. Louis was. Next slide, please. And let's go on to the next one, because this is clearer. On the left, you'll have Clarksdale train station in 1918. This is what Williams left from, coming to the Midwest. On the right is Union Station, what he came to. I think the juxtapositions of the architecture tell us all we need to, first of all, how Edwina felt demoralized by the big city, and also how Tennessee Williams felt overwhelmed by the big city. He spoke with an accent. He was unpopular with other kids. He kept to himself. He was morbidly shy. And as I recount in the book, the first thing spoken to him upon arrival in St. Louis was his hand being slapped for stealing a grape at a nearby fruit vendor. And those first words were, never let me catch you stealing again. And they proved very prophetic. St. Louis was a place of recrimination and suppression for Williams, and the antithesis of the freedom he found in New Orleans. Next slide. This is the happy family all together here in St. Louis in the early years. Their first home, I mentioned that they moved 9 times, was a boarding house in the Central West End. And as I pointed out, Edwina kept trying to move them farther and farther west. Next slide, please. This is the school where Tom was enrolled, the Eugene Field School in St. Louis, and it certainly has a kind of ominous feeling, and he was very unhappy at that first school. Next. Here's a picture of him in contemplative solitude, which I find very interesting also. Just a lovely photograph of Williams. Next. Here he is on the right with his younger brother Dakin, poolside. Williams found freedom in St. Louis at the Lorelei Natatorium, and he really became an avid swimmer. He loved the water through his whole life. At Key West, he would take daily morning swims, and water in his plays is a form of escape. His relationship with his brother was fractured and difficult. I mentioned earlier that Dakin had him institutionalized to save his life, and he did save his life by tricking him into being institutionalized at Barnes in 1969. But Williams never forgot it and never forgave, and took his brother out of his will for that. Next slide. Here he is graduating from U City High. And I mentioned at Ben Blewett and U City High, Williams really started to decide that he wanted to become, in his words, a journalist at that point. He wrote these travel logs. His grandfather took him on a tour of Europe, and he wrote down his reflections, and they're quite amazing to read. They suggest a highly precocious mind. And of course, he went on, like any undergraduate would, to University of Missouri in 1929. Next slide, please. Here is Rose when she was starting to show signs of mental illness. This is a picture when she was going to have her debut like any girl of the South, only it failed. It was not successful. Next slide, please. Many of you will have already been and know the Forest Park Jewel Box. And of course, this is an interesting image from the Glass Menagerie. It's a metaphor for where Rose, or Laura, I should say, finds herself alone. And the jewel box becomes a kind of metaphor for the Glass Menagerie itself. And it's significant, of course, that Williams found that image here in St. Louis. When we had our conference in 2004, we held the reception in the jewel box where the lectures were held. Next slide, please. You can see something of the interior of the jewel box in a contemporary photo. Now it's used mainly for events like like that, like parties, but at the time it must have offered seclusion, this area, this huge greenhouse, and again underscores Laura's isolation, her communion with certain favorite objects like the Glass Menagerie itself here in St. Louis. Next slide, please. I discovered when I was working on this book that I thought originally that that calling St. Louis Saint Pollution was an act of vituperation. He hated it here, so he called it Saint Pollution. It sounds good. But in fact, I discovered that St. Louis, which ran on bituminous coal, the soft coal, was one of the most highly polluted cities in the country and had been so throughout the 1930s. This slide is the infamous slide of Black Tuesday, November 11th, 1939, when this was taken at noon, this image. And so when he calls St. Louis Saint Pollution, he was actually speaking literally about something that he knew firsthand. And if you go back and look at some of his early writing, St. Louis is always a place where you can never open the windows and never see the sky. One of the ironic things about his writing of Streetcar Named Desire was in New Orleans. He had a room where he could open the skylight and see the sky. And it was, again, the antithesis of St. Louis. St. Louis was a place that was associated with darkness and smog, whereas New Orleans was a place he could at least see the sky. And so from a writing perspective, obviously a much healthier choice for him. Next slide. Here is the statue of Saint Louis. It's particularly prominent, and I discovered that in one of his early short stories called Oriflamme, it's written on the slide, the young girl who is ill and consumptive sets out on a pilgrimage of her own until she is confronted by the statue of Louis IX on Art Hill. And Williams anthropomorphizes the horse and the statue as all that is militant and all that opposes freedom. And shortly after that, the girl goes to a dried up fountain where there are only birds playing. And then Williams, in more artful way than I can describe it, says that her throat became another fountain as she bleeds into the dry, desiccated leaves of the fountain. So it's an example of where Williams sees St. Louis as an outright antagonist to freedom and agency in his work. Next slide, please. Here's a picture of the auditorium at Soldan, where Rose Williams was enrolled, and Williams went for a semester. They moved him out to go to U City High School because they thought it had a better educational possibility for him. Laura talks about the clumping. I had that brace on my leg, it clumped so loud when describing her disability. But of course, her disability is in some ways a kind of metaphor for the emotional illness that Rose was suffering from, and which she was lobotomized for in 1943. Next slide. Here's U City High School in all its splendor. And I think Williams really found himself there in many respects. He was not a good student, but as I said, his teachers cultivated his talent. They encouraged his writing a travel journal when they found out his grandfather was going to take him on a tour of Europe. Next slide. Here is the model for the Wingfield apartment at 4633 Westminster. Those of you that were able to attend the Tennessee Williams Festival this last year realized that the actors were housed there, and they used the back facade with the fire escapes as the background for a production of the Glass Menagerie done outdoors. Since we've had the St. Louis Tennessee Williams Festival now, and it's for 6 years, and it's done much to right the wrongs, as it were, and to remember that Tennessee Williams is intimately connected with St. Louis. By contrast, the festival in New Orleans has been running for about 30 years or more. And of course, it's a much larger festival. But thanks to Carrie Hauk, the artistic director of this festival, St. Louis is now being recognized as a place where Williams not only wanted to get away, but where he lived and where he created. Next slide. Tom at 24 doesn't need much explanation, I think. Next. Here's another picture of Rose outside St. Vincent's Sanatorium. They're very sad with a parasol, just to illuminate what Williams had to go through. When I said to you earlier that in 1937, the Lady Chantine was a portrait, his first portrait of a neurasthenic female, we can see why this was so powerful. It was then in 1937 that he both wrote Mivasha, but no one had a way of knowing this. But during that same time, Rose was being hospitalized at St. Vincent's. So Williams was literally confronted by the horrible trauma of seeing his sister go mad, and tried to write about it in Mivasha, and that attempt was greeted only with ridicule, not sympathy. So it's a tragic episode, and one that surely helped form the way Williams thought about St. Louis and about Washington University at that time. Next slide. This is just a slide from Washington Avenue west toward 15th Street, where the International Shoe Company was. And of course, Williams had to trek from the West End downtown every day. And what's interesting is that that experience was not lost on him. Here's a middle-class kid going down every day. I shouldn't say a kid. By then he would have been 1935, so he would have been in 24 or so, 23, 24. But he met a different kind of patron. He saw the homeless people living on shacks at the riverfront. He saw artists giving of their time to teach drawing and teach writing for free. He saw socialists. He met with communists. I told you that he worked closely with Clark Mills, who was editing the Anvil at this time. So he became acquainted with different types of people. And if you look at those early plays, which until now have been dismissed for the most part as acts of juvenilia, before Williams really found himself with Glass Menagerie, you find that his sense of character was already present. If you look at a tiny postage stamp size engraving by a Rembrandt, you can still see that the technique is quite remarkable. Well, if you look at snatches of dialogue by Williams in his 20s, in Candles to the Sun, or Not About Nightingales, or Spring Storm, you see that there is a masterful sense of language and human character that was there even during these times when he was writing in St. Louis, long before anyone knew who Tom Williams would become. Next slide. Here he is dressed up as a corporate person at International Shoe. Next slide. Here's Washington University in a contemporary slide. Next. Here's Williams at Brown Hall playing. Williams is the fourth character from the right, awkwardly gesticulating. The main character was his good friend, the great poet, William J. Smith, who's donated his papers as well to special collections here at Washington University. And in his 90s, Bill Smith wrote a memoir of his time with Tennessee Williams, and how Williams is really and should always be seen first and foremost as a poet. So Williams has the lead role as Scapin in the Molière play that Williams was in while he was at WashU. Thyrsis, take note. Next slide. And here he is on the extreme left, in the front row left. And if you look at all the way at the front right, or I'm sorry, in the second row on the right is his classmate, then A.E. Hotchner. So this is evidence that Williams actually was here, as much as we've seen, he didn't really want to recognize that fact. He was a member of the Eliot staff, and interestingly enough, continued to produce poetry and to submit poetry at the Eliot even after he had left Washington University. By the way, for those of you who are interested, he finished up at the University of Iowa, which had then a very distinguished playwriting program. So he graduated finally at the age of 27 as an undergraduate from Iowa. Next slide. This is just an example of 2 metaphysical sonnets that he published in the Eliot, both before, during, and after his time at Washington University. Next slide. This slide is shown to the figure in the center, who is rather small, difficult to see, is actually one off the center. On the left is Clark Mills, and on the right is Bill Smith, contemporaries of Williams, who remained, in the case of Bill Smith, remained a tremendous admirer of Williams. And as I said, even in his 90s, wrote an astonishing memoir. And again, Bill Smith is a close friend of Washington University's. This photo was loaned by Bill Smith's son. William Smith also has graced the library with a number of recordings and poetry readings. So he was what is today considered the poet laureate of the United States. So we shouldn't know him only as Tennessee Williams' friend, but as an eminent poet in his own right. Next slide. Here's the famous Blue Book that I found, Washington University stores, campus store, and so on. And you see the signature as I would have seen it in 2005 at the Faulkner Bookshop. Next slide. This is how I saw the poem at the end of the Greek exam. It's probably difficult for you to focus in on the word blue here, but if you look at the word blue closely, underneath you'll see the word sad in pencil, but scratched out. Next slide, please. This is a manuscript, of course, of Mivasha that Williams submitted. And of course, he was desperately unhappy because he said everyone in the class, because Williams was then in his mid-20s, assumed Williams would win the poetry prize, the playwriting prize that came out of the English 16 contest. Instead, he got honorable mention, and he never showed up at Graham Chapel to receive his certificate of honorable mention. But the fact remains that the play was done here. And of course, there are many reasons why it was not recognized, but of course, it had an exaggerated importance for Williams, both because he realized he was failing Greek at the time and because he received no recognition beside honorable mention. And he was the only established and produced playwright in the entire class. So it was humiliating to him. Personally, he hoped to show his father that he could actually earn some money off writing. And instead, all he got was this crummy t-shirt. No, I'm sorry. All he got was this crummy honorable mention certificate. Next slide. This is a program for the Mummers, for Candles to the Sun, Williams' first production with the Mummers, and it's one that William J. Smith actually attended. It was given 2 performances by the Mummers, but it's evidence, of course, that Williams was doing plays during this time that he was at Washington University. You can see the cast size here. Next slide. Candles to the Sun, by the way, before I leave it, got very good reviews from the St. Louis. We should go back to the previous slide. I'm sorry, Lauren. The previous slide, because the reviewer in the Post-Dispatch actually reviewed this amateur production by the Mummers and said it was very obvious from the dialogue that the writer had been to the Red Hills of Alabama. Of course, nothing could be farther from the truth. Williams didn't even go to see a mine in writing this play about coal mining. He had planned to go in Illinois to a mine, but that trip was canceled. So again, the dialogue was entirely out of his head and made up. It just shows how astonishingly precocious Williams was as a playwright in his mid-20s, and was already writing for a large audience. It also shows us Williams' early interest in social thoughts and social issues. Next slide. Here's a picture of Edwina, and you can see she was in some ways a great lady. She was a Southern belle, even though she happened to be born in Waynesville, Ohio, I guess as all great Southern belles are. But she continued to put on airs and wouldn't stop talking, and was apparently very, very difficult. Near the end of his life, Williams at one moment was caught saying she was a tiny Prussian officer in drag. You can see on the right, there is a sort of formidable quality of her, but at the same time, her love of language and stories probably had a direct influence on Williams' work as a writer. Next slide. Here is Laurette Taylor. The photograph is signed by Laurette Taylor herself in the Glass Menagerie. The play opened in Chicago, and as I said before, made Williams' reputation instantly. However, when Edwina went backstage, Laurette Taylor said, "Well, Mrs. Williams, what does it feel like to see yourself on stage?" And Edwina Williams was horrified at the suggestion, and she said in her biography, the only thing that Laurette Taylor and she had in common was that they loved jonquils, which he's holding here. And if you're familiar with Glass Menagerie, you'll remember the famous jonquil speech. Next slide. Here is Julie Hayden, the original Laura in Glass Menagerie with the glass animals. The play, by the way, the Glass Menagerie, was originally directed by Eddie Dowling, who is much older than we imagine Tom to be in the play. And he also insisted on certain changes. For example, the drunk scene was done at the behest of Eddie Dowling, and Williams insisted, though, on writing it back. But at that time, as a young playwright, of course, he did what the director wanted. Next slide. Williams is not very well known as a painter, but he started painting as well. And this was just a lovely self-portrait that he said. He wrote on it, very flattering, even then, Tennessee. But I just thought it would be an interesting side note to say Williams went to New Orleans, as I mentioned, in 1938. And then after he left New Orleans, and his first impressions were not, although they were very favorable, were somewhat mixed. And he didn't immediately embrace his own sexuality. That took some time. He was threatened by it, and he was frightened by New Orleans, and he left right at the beginning of Mardi Gras. He went with his friend, a roommate, Jim Parrott, and he started studying painting with Jim Parrott's mother in Los Angeles. And this early painting is the fruit of that expedition toward the visual arts. Next slide. Here's a lovely Post-Dispatch interview, which I had to reproduce. St. Louisans, cold, smug, complacent. Wonderful. And you can read the rest of the subtitle of the review. And of course, this is from 1947, after Williams now was famous and got to send one back at St. Louis and punch back, if you like. They had to acknowledge his celebrity, his fame, the fact that he was from St. Louis, but also that he didn't like it. 1947 then. Thank you. Next slide. Here's a picture which I just thought was interesting. He came back to St. Louis in his memory in certain late plays, among them A Lovely Sunday for Creve Coeur, which is a play that was put on excellently by the St. Louis Festival a couple of years ago. And this is Creve Coeur Lake Station, which is the denouement of of the play, where the character returns and joins a picnic in Creve Coeur. And it's sort of interesting that my own thesis, my own contention in the book is that Williams, although he hated it here and needed to leave it, had a kind of truce with the city in this, as depicted in this late play, which is a kind of undoing in some ways in comedy of the Glass Menagerie, which is anything but comic. Next slide. This is just a shot from this fine production that was done by the Tennessee Williams Festival in St. Louis. Next slide. Okay, next slide. And here, returning to Graham Chapel and the stronghold of the reactionaries, which is what Williams called Washington University exactly 40 years prior. He came back to St. Louis to speak at Graham Chapel, give a poetry reading, and there was really no bitterness in his tone. He embraced the city, but in the review, talking about the visit, they did mention his reaction when they passed Barnes Hospital and talked about that, and clearly gave him pause. But so this was in 1977. Remember, Williams was at Barnes, back in Barnes in 1969 in that visit, which was so horrific, but which probably, in all fairness, saved his life. Williams was plagued by drug and opiate addiction, alcoholism for much of his life. And of course, but that's not the whole story. There's much more. There's much more than this kind of discussion can even begin to say. We're talking about a man who is likely the greatest playwright America has ever produced. And 20 years of his life, and crucial years of formation and Bildung in the German sense, were done here in St. Louis. I think we can stop here and turn to questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Schvey. This has just been wonderful. And most of the comments that came in the, there were some comments in the chat, weren't really questions, but people saying just how wonderful this was, how much that they have, they've learned, and how much they've enjoyed this. But there are a few questions that did come in. Someone had asked a bit early about the short story, Basha, and they had asked if I think you had mentioned that it had been published, and we did find that it isn't it's something that as you know, that we have a collection of Tennessee Williams short stories entitled The Magic Tower and Other One-Act Plays that was published in 2011. So someone had asked about that because they wanted to read it, I assume.
Yes, it's a part of it. It was collected by Thomas Keith, edited by Thomas Keith, with The Magic Tower and other plays. The other plays are interesting, but if you look at that, if you see that publication, it does mention, and I'm very happy to say this, with the cast of our production at Washington University, acknowledging the fact that it was done first here in 2004, whenever it was done.
Okay, great. Right. There was another question, and this was, quoting, reading The Glass Menagerie, it was evident to me that he, Williams, is slipping away from the family to cruise for sex in the movie theater and likely other places. I haven't seen any concrete documentation of that I recall. Did Tennessee Williams ever talk about this?
You know, sometimes the movies are just the movies, but sometimes they also stand in placeholders for other things. There's a very fine book on the subject that discusses this kind of an interpretation, and I think it's possible to see the movies in a double way. In a way, it does in when Williams wrote the play, it would have been more true as a reflection of the time in the 30s. Williams still not only had he not come out as gay, but he wasn't aware of that coming out yet. I think that's fair to say. So we can read it at the movies as an escape, and we can read the movies as an opportunity for a tryst. And of course, Williams was famous for his cruising, and it becomes the subject of a lot of discussion. So I think it's fair to see it both ways, both in hindsight, Williams attributing this characteristic, and it's also possible to see it as movies. St. Louis was considered a movie capital of the world, by the way, in the 1930s, and we forget about this, but it had more movie theaters per capita per square foot, as it were, than New York City in the mid 1930s, which is when Glass Menagerie is set, although it was written in the mid 40s. So there's something to be said for both readings, and I think one should feel free to not insist on it as another reading, but to see it as an alternate. The book, by the way, is called Gentlemen Callers, and it's written by Michael Paller, who's at the ACT in San Francisco, and it's an excellent study of homosexuality and its relationship to Williams' plays. I strongly recommend it. Thank you.
All right. We have another, this is more of a comment, but I'll read this quote. I have read Blue Song numerous times, but just thought of this question listening to you. Do you think there could be a direct connection to the Greek exam itself in the poem? Tired of speech and action, I can tell you only my name and the name of the town I was born in. Then they're going to say, this sounds a little like he could not get beyond basic Greek grammar conversation. I don't know if this is obvious or totally off the mark, but I'd like to picture him writing the poem instead of finishing the exam, end of quote.
I think that's I understand where the questioner is going with that. And I think that that's fair. I think that it's both. It's both. I mean, just as any poem is a reflection, perhaps, of the circumstances in which the speaker is writing or the poet is writing, it suggests a point of stasis, of deadlock, of frustration. But I think that's fair to say that it's a reflection of the exam itself, of the sense of suffocation that he must have felt in knowing. In his diary, the night before the exam, he talks about the tomorrow Greek examination, which I will undoubtedly flunk. So Williams knew, it was no surprise to him that he was unprepared for the exam, and he went swimming the next day instead of studying it for it. So I think that the question is accurate, but the fact that it refers to the exam itself doesn't preclude it having reference outside that exam, and seeing in some ways as a reflection of Williams' own state of mind at that point. And I think in some ways that's a more useful way of looking at the poem as a depiction of his state of mind. But it's also true that it depicts what he was feeling at that second when he was writing the exam.
Okay, all right. As for our last question, actually, this was something, I'm going to take liberty. This was one of my questions, Professor Schvey. So in the question had been thinking about if Tennessee Williams ever came to think of St. Louis differently. And when you discussed the last play about Creve Coeur, I think you've answered that he did think a little bit differently. He expressed his thoughts differently about St. Louis than he had previously.
I think so.
You want to comment on that or not?
Yeah, I think it's a fair point. I mean, I think, of course, as we age, certain emotions don't necessarily last. And I think one would be very surprised if at, say, 65, he was the same person he was at 25. He wasn't. And I think that his success and he was able at certain moments to reflect on that. And I think the character of Bodie in one of those pictures that we just looked at is a kind of personification of South St. Louis. Lauren, I don't know if you can go back to the slide of the play, but I can show you that. It's back about 5 slides from where you stopped at the end. Keep going back. Yeah, any of those. Yeah, go forward now. No, yeah, there. I mean, Bodhi is a character who lives in South St. Louis. She's very provincial in her taste. She wears a huge chrysanthemum in her hair. Why? To obscure a hearing aid. So she's a colorful character, but her portrayal in this play is affectionate. It's not demeaning. It's not snarky, as we would say today. She is a picture of a woman who is caring and profoundly concerned with the welfare of the other girl, Dorothy, who is trying to fix the flower in her hair. So I think it's important, and I think that does reflect some measure of accommodation, of acceptance of St. Louis, not just as this provincial backwater that stifled his growth, but as something more than that. Thank you. Yeah, that's...
And the last were really just comments, and so we'll end with these. Quote, Hendry, as always, you are fascinating and an engaging speaker, and even more so on this topic. Thank you. And the following one, thank you so much for this thoughtful lecture. You've made me want to revisit Williams' plays. There is clearly so much to discover within the text. And I think that is our collected opinion, Professor Schvey. I'd like to thank Professor Schvey for this wonderful talk. I would also like to thank the other staff that have contributed to this, Brad Short, Lauren Strabel, our events and communications coordinator, and Shannon Sowell, the Senior Associate Director for Advancement for the University Libraries. I think Professor Schvey may have us adding some of Tennessee Williams' works to our reading list. And if you're wondering where to begin, well, here's a tip from me as a librarian. You might want to start with Professor Schvey's book, Blue Song, the St. Louis and the Life and Work of Tennessee Williams, published by University of Missouri Press 2021, available wherever you buy books. Thanks again for joining us today. And I would like to invite you to our upcoming faculty book talks. On November 3rd, music professor Patrick Burke will discuss his latest book, Tear Down the Walls, White Radicalism and Black Power in the 1960s Rock music. That was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2021. And on November 17th, please join us as feminist scholar, Assistant Professor Heather Berg discusses her latest book, Porn Work, Sex, Labor, and Late Capitalism. Both of those will begin at 4:30 p.m. And the registration links for both of those talks are on the library's website at library.wustl.edu/events. Thank you for attending and have a wonderful rest of the evening. Goodbye, everyone.